Howitzers roar like thunder, dropping unimaginably dense clouds of shells on muddy trenches as whistles blow and khaki-clad Tommies clamber over the top, charging towards the Germans in the titanic, merciless Battle of Arras. To them, the old world and all its romance and splendor seems dead. They are sparring with the bayonet, charging the Maxim gun, and praying for just a few minutes more of life while scurrying across the detritus-encrusted battlefield, here at the point in the war where civilization seems to be crumbling. But while the old world looks dead in Flanders and France, bits and pieces of that Victorian heyday that's colored with such rose-tinted romance are still alive, including the famous Rajah of Sarawak, where, in the humid and heavy air of May 1917, as the Battle of Arras rages, a new era is dawning over the winding Sarawak River halfway around the world in the Royal Astana Palace in Kuching. The old lion, Sir Charles Brooke, is dead, and in his place standing a man who seems cut from a very different cloth. Charles Vyner Brooke, known to the world simply as Vyner, is now the third White Rajah. He has inherited a realm that was part medieval fiefdom, part tropical paradise, and, increasingly, a vital cog in the global industrial machine. It is a land of change, but also one of romance, with tales of headhunters and pirates still lurking in the jungles as vast flows of oil pour from its wealth-building offshore rigs. Vyner will attempt to lead it through this transition, to hold on to and enhance his unique and wonderful patrimony, even as the world collapses around him. This is the story of Vyner Brooke, the tale of a man caught between two centuries, a gentle prince who preferred the quiet life of a country gentleman, but was tasked with guiding a private kingdom into the blinding light of the 20th century, and did so not with the sword of his forefathers, but the clever diplomacy that could have so much helped his countrymen back in France. While history sometimes paints him as the more relaxed, perhaps even detached, successor to his formidable father, a closer look reveals a Rajah who presided over Sarawak's greatest economic flourishing, a man who loved his people with a paternalistic devotion, and a man who eventually attempted to do what no absolute monarch ever does willingly, give the power back to his people. Welcome back to The Old World with Will Tanner, the show where we tell the tales of the great colonial adventures, magnificent American and British families of the world that used to exist. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share all these videos around if you like them, as that's how we grow and keep this project going. This time, we're picking back up with the tales of the White Rajahs of Sarawak, looking at the life of the third and last Rajah, Vyner Brooke. Vyner was born in London in 1874, the eldest son of Rajah Charles and Rani Margaret. From the beginning, his life was a study in contrasts. His mother, the cultured and artistic Margaret Brooke, the famous Rani, who did not get along with her difficult husband, brought a touch of European sophistication to the Astana and Kuching, filling Vyner's early years with music and literature. His father, however, was, as we covered last time, a man of iron in the jungle. Charles Brooke was a stern ruler and lifelong fighter who believed that a Rajah should be part soldier, part judge, and entirely tireless. The relationship between father and son was famously fraught. Charles viewed Vyner as too soft, too modern, and certainly too fond of the comforts of England. So, to harden him, Charles sent Vyner into the deep interior of Sarawak as a young officer. He wasn't allowed to live in the palace. Much as Charles had been sent by his uncle out into the horrid jungles of Sarawak to fight headhunters for years on end, Vyner had to prove himself in the forts of the 2nd and 3rd Divisions, regions deep in the jungle at the heart of Brooke rule, learning the languages of the Iban and the Malays, and settling disputes over stray water buffalo and contested fruit trees, while carrying out the occasional campaign against what headhunters or small-time pirates remained in the murky Sarawakian interior. This training was a grueling, still romantic, immersion into the Brooke philosophy of rule. Vyner lived in remote outposts like Semangang and Kapit, where the only connection to the outside world was the rhythmic dip of a paddle in the vast rivers. As he served in those jungles and rivers, bringing Brooke rule to the blighted, Vyner learned that to rule Sarawak was not to sit on a throne, but to sit on a mat in a longhouse, listening to the endless grievances and disputes of his subjects. He learned diplomacy and how to manage the natives. He learned how to do so well from these missions in the jungle. It was in the wild stretches of the 2nd Division of Sarawak, the southwestern part of the state, an area in which the Brookes had long been trying to imprint their rule, that Vyner first truly stepped out from his father's shadow, most notably during the Banting uprising, often called the Semangang Incident of 1903. A group of Iban Sea Dyaks, those ancient, sometimes enemies and sometimes allies of the Brooke Raj, led by the defiant Banting, had retreated to the nearly impregnable heights of Bukit Ulu Ai. While the old Rajah Charles favored the blunt instrument of overwhelming force, Vyner, then a young officer learning the ropes, demonstrated a different kind of steel. He spent months navigating the treacherous river systems and dense jungles, not just as a soldier, but as a diplomat. In a display of what would become his trademark calm, he managed to isolate the rebels by winning over the local chiefs through patience and respect for their adat, or customary law. He proved that a Rajah could, with the big pirate and headhunter insurgencies long since crushed by James and Charles, lead through rapport as effectively as through a rifle, a feat of quiet brilliance that even his stern father acknowledged with a rare nod of approval. Paired with that success was the reminder that his father was not perfect, something that gave Charles a bit of added confidence in his disputes with Vyner with disputes with Charles. For example, in 1902, Vyner accompanied his father on the infamous cholera expedition against rebels in the Batang Lupar. This was meant to be a grand display of Brooke power. The fleet of thousands of warriors headed into the deep interior to strike against a rebel force and enforce the might of Brooke rule. But as they pushed into this humid interior, an invisible enemy struck. Cholera, warnings of which the indomitable Charles had arrogantly ignored, swept through the camps with terrifying speed. Vyner watched as his father's grand campaign dissolved into a nightmare. Over 1,000 men loyal to the Brookes perished in the stinking mud of the jungle, not by the spear or blow dart, but by the plague. Vyner was haunted by this and the punitive expedition that led to it. Though he could fight and could be around death without breaking under pressure, this incident led him to resolve to rule differently, to move Sarawak away from the era of the blood feud and toward the era of the hospital and the school, toward a world where such suffering would not occur because it needn't occur. So, while the job might have been tiresome at times, Vyner was quite good at it and growing in confidence, particularly in terms of his diplomatic skills and ability to deal with the Ibans. While the relentlessly critical Charles found him lacking in drive, the people of Sarawak found Vyner approachable, possessing a gentle humor and a lack of the terrifying sternness that characterized his father. He was the people's Rajah before he ever wore the crown. This continued for years, but eventually it was time for Vyner to leave the jungle and develop as a civilized man. So he returned to civilization to start ruling rather than just sweating in the jungle on minor missions. This was, in many ways, the most difficult expedition Vyner ever undertook, as he had to fight to secure his own inheritance from his skeptical father. Rajah Charles, increasingly embittered by Vyner's modern sensibilities, problem exacerbated by his marriage to the spirited Sylvia Brett, more on that in a minute, spent his final years trying to tighten the leash on the heir he had done so much to train. In fact, in a move that bordered on a royal coup, Charles created a trustee committee in London designed to supervise Vyner from afar, effectively attempting to rule from London, then the grave. He even made overtures toward Vyner's brother, Bertram, hoping to find a more traditional successor who would rule as he had. The Brookes always had trouble handing off power. Just remember the saga of Brooke and his feud with Rajah James from the life of Charles. Yet, Vyner overcame this final obstruction with the surprising display of Brooke tenacity. By cultivating the unwavering loyalty of the Sarawak civil service, the local Malay and Iban leaders, Vyner ensured that when the old Rajah finally passed, the people of Sarawak stood behind him. He quietly but firmly dismantled the committee's influence, proving that while he might have preferred a polo mallet to a sword, he possessed the political cunning to preserve the independence of his throne. It was over this period of Vyner ruling for his father, who had retired to cool and pleasant England, that, in 1911, Vyner made a move that further rankled Charles. He married the Honorable Sylvia Brett, daughter of Lord Esher. Sylvia was a glamorous, dashing figure of the bright young things era, witty, flamboyant, and entirely unconventional. Yet further, much as the Rani had once tried to do, Sylvia brought a whirlwind of social energy to Sarawak that dressed up and reinvigorated the romance in what had been at danger of becoming a has-been land, place of commerce and trade, but not colonial joy or romance. So, while old Rajah Charles grumbled about the extravagance of the new generation, Vyner and Sylvia created a court that often felt like a royal household out of a romantic colonial novel, despite the reality of the oppressive heat and occasional difficulties with the natives. They had 3 daughters, Leonora, Elizabeth, and Sylvia, known as the Princesses of Sarawak, but no son. This lack of a male heir would haunt Vyner's reign, precipitating a slow-burning succession crisis that was to explode in the aftermath of Sarawak's greatest tragedy, many years on. But for now, with civilization still intact and the Rajahs firmly atop the throne, the succession was settled, even if unpleasant. The will of the first Rajah, James Brooke, dictated that the throne must pass through the male line according to the patrilineal principle. This was eventually to be a problem, for it meant that Vyner's younger brother, Bertram, the Tuan Muda, was the legal heir. If he died before the succession, he would be followed by his son, Anthony. Vyner, who adored his daughters and perhaps felt the weight of his father's lingering shadow, often found himself at odds with the Brooke traditionalists, who looked toward Anthony as the future of the Raj and were determined that it ought continue on that basis. Still, for now, all was well, and Vyner set about building with the infinite time horizons of a consummate aristocrat. And during the middle of the First World War, he got just the opportunity to start doing so in a very real way. He was the Rajah. When the news finally arrived in May of 1917 that the old Lion Charles had breathed his last in England, a heavy, breathless silence fell over Kuching. Charles Brooke had ruled for 49 years, just shy of half a century, nearly all of that time spent in Sarawak, in person. For the vast majority of Sarawakians, he was the only Rajah they had ever known. On the morning of May 24th, beneath a sky thick with the promise of a monsoon, Vyner stood on the deck of the yacht Zahora to be proclaimed the third White Rajah. His inheritance had been secured. He had won. The somber ceremony was a moment of profound transition, heavy with the weight of Brooke tradition. There was no glittering coronation in the European sense, particularly not as the Great War raged, only the simple, solemn recognition by the Malay datus and the tribal chiefs. As he stepped onto the pier, Vyner looked less like a conquering monarch and more like a man accepting a sacred, if somewhat daunting, trust. In his inaugural speech, he lacked the terrifying, steel-eyed presence of his father, whose concerns he had overcome in the end. But he offered something the people hadn't felt in decades, a sense of approachability. He famously addressed the gathered crowd, promising to protect their customs and declaring, "I wish you all to tell me if you're in trouble. Never be afraid to come to me." As the royal yellow flag was hoisted, the era of the stern old Rajah ended, and the reign of the People's Rajah began, marked by a gentle promise of continuity in an increasingly chaotic world. Despite the personal dramas of the Astana and London, Vyner's reign, both when he was nominally in charge and when he later took over from his father during the world crisis of the Great War, was marked by an explosion of economic vitality that Vyner did much to stimulate. Under his hand, what had just been a land of small-scale farming, primitive mines, and occasional traders in his grandfather's time, in moderate, if slow prosperity built primarily by vast territorial growth and some infrastructure improvement during his father's, became a modern resource powerhouse that skyrocketed upwards in immense prosperity like the oil geysers that fueled its growth. The crown jewel of Vyner's economy was oil. Just before Vyner took the throne, oil had been discovered in Miri. Under Vyner's encouragement, the Anglo-Saxon Petroleum Company, a precursor to Shell, transformed the sleepy coastal village into a bustling industrial frontier, pouring in investment dollars that put Sarawak on the map for more than just colonial enthusiasts for the first time in its history. By the 1920s, the Grand Old Lady, Sarawak's first oil well, was pumping wealth into the state treasury to an immense degree. Imagine the scene, the pristine jungle of the northern coast suddenly punctuated by wooden derricks, the smell of brine mixing with the heavy scent of crude oil, and the sound of steam engines echoing where once only the hornbill called and pirates roamed in primitive canoes while wearing headdresses made of feathers. This was the new Sarawak, modern, industrial, and very wealthy. Oil production skyrocketed, providing the funds Vyner needed to modernize the state without ever having to go into debt to the British Crown or beg and scrounge for dribs and drabs of capital deposited into the Borneo Company, as the previous Rajahs had. While oil fueled the north, the Borneo Company Limited remained the backbone of the state's commerce. The BCL was a behemoth, holding monopolies on minerals and finally developing them well in a trade that was quite profitable for the new Rajah. Particularly in the Bao and Bidi regions, they used an innovative process to extract gold from the earth, producing a huge number of ounces, perhaps even 1 million during Vyner's era, a tidy sum that quite aided the ruler of this tidy land. But it wasn't just gold. Sarawak was a global leader in antimony and quicksilver, Kinabar. Deep in the jungle, miners toiled to bring these essential metals to the world market, shipping them downriver in flotillas of prahus to be loaded onto BCL steamers bound for Singapore and London, further invigorating the trade capacity of Sarawak and its national wealth and importance, all while being tinted with the romance that came with Sarawak's history. That was far from all. Vyner also oversaw the great rubber boom, which he used to help enrich the natives of Sarawak by encouraging smallholder cultivation, allowing the local Malays and Dayaks to plant white gold on their own land, rather than just in large plantations that only benefited Europeans. This innovation, along with the growth of other forms of commercial agriculture, such as pepper, meant that during the high-price years of the early 20th century, Sarawak's exports of rubber, sago, and pepper reached record heights. The riverbanks were lined with pepper gardens and rubber groves. The bazaars of Kuching and Cebu were thick with the smells of drying sago and aromatic resins collected from the deep forest. Sarawak was finally wealthy, and finally looking like what the first White Rajah had long imagined. Vyner used this wealth to weave a web of infrastructure across his wild domain. He was a champion of connectivity, engaging in infrastructure projects that were both necessary and tinged with romance, much as his father's railway had been. Under his rule, the Sarawak Government Railway, built by his father, continued to puff its way from Kuching across the Rajah's dominions, a charming, narrow-gauge line that brought the romance of steam to the primordial jungle. Meanwhile, wireless telegraphy stations were erected in remote outposts like Miri, Sadong, and Cebu, allowing the Rajah to communicate with his officers in minutes rather than weeks, deepening his rule across the vast domains of Sarawak. Kuching, meanwhile, was transformed into a modern city with macadamized roads, a reliable piped water supply, and even electricity. Over these roads, Vyner could drive. Charles had hated automobiles. The port of Kuching was again modernized, made capable of handling the massive steamships of the Straits Steamship Company, which arrived laden with luxury goods from Europe and left heavy with the raw materials of the Borneo jungle. All in all, this economic build-out was massive and meant that, even during the Great Depression of the 1920s and 30s, when the price of rubber and oil plummeted, Vyner's Sarawak remained remarkably resilient. Because he had avoided the massive debt cycles of other colonial territories and maintained a policy of native-first agriculture, the people of Sarawak were able to retreat to their rice fields and sago groves to weather the global storm, and his little Raj continued to prosper and thrive, thanks largely to his hard work and intelligent investments in development of it. Yet, for all its oil wells and wireless stations, Vyner's Sarawak was increasingly seen as a beautiful anachronism. In a world of rising nationalism, communism, and cold colonial bureaucracy, the Raj was an oddity, a sovereign state ruled by a somewhat eccentric English family as their personal property. The Brooke rule, after all, was a form of enlightened despotism. There was no free press, no elections, and the word of the Rajah was final. That privilege was rarely abused, as the Rajahs all cared for the natives and ruled justly, but it nevertheless was a fact that flew in the face of modernity. Vyner's officers, the little tin gods, ruled their districts with a blend of paternalism and firm authority, often acting as judge, jury, and father figure to the local population. It all smacked of a paternalism that was beneficial, but also becoming considered passé. Vyner himself seemed to feel the weight of this status. He was a man of the 20th century who knew his 19th century throne was precarious. He spent more and more time in England, leaving the day-to-day administration to his brother Bertram or his senior officers. This absenteeism led to criticisms, but it also allowed for a more professional civil service to develop. As the 1930s drew to a close, the shadows of war began to lengthen over Southeast Asia. Nevertheless, in 1941, just before the war began, Sarawak prepared to celebrate the centenary of Brooke rule. It was a moment of immense pride, 100 years of peace, progress, and independence. Vyner decided to mark the centenary with a revolutionary act. On September 24th, 1941, he proclaimed the 1941 Constitution of Sarawak. This document, founded on the 9 cardinal principles, was designed to end the absolute power of the Rajah and move Sarawak towards self-government. It established a legislature and a council, formalizing the idea that the Rajah was the trustee, not the owner of the state. Critics have often suggested this constitution was a buyout, a deal with the British to secure Vyner's financial future in exchange for surrendering power eventually. But to the people of Sarawak, it was a profound gesture of trust. Vyner was telling his subjects that they were ready to guide their own destiny, which he claimed had always been the goal of Sir James. And then the Japanese attacked, and everything went awry. That is where we will pick up next time. Thank you for listening. Please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel.